had to and has come to support her. So it's like family time. Thank you so much. I don't have to sell the Babcock-Smith House Museum, but I do have to sell the next program, which is June 17th. Bob, is that right?
Yeah.
June 17th.
I guess so, yes.
Bob is going to be doing a two-person reading of Philip Furneaux's war poetry at the library, not here. So check the website for those details. The time is different, it's not a Sunday afternoon, etc. Of course, I have to hawk the cemetery tours. We're going not for a funeral, but to see the masters. We're revisiting the masters in the cemetery for the summer tour. So lots going on, and I will now tell you how I found Sara. Okay. So I was looking for programs that had something to do with the 250th. And years ago, George Champlin, who's Sarah's father, did a program for us on a currency. You remember that one? Yeah. With the policeman or whatever in the back who attended. Made me a little nervous, but it was an excellent program. So I called him to say, would you repeat that currency program for us or do something similar? And he said, well, I know a guy, and George isn't going to do it, but the I know a guy person is doing it, so I'm very grateful.
Right, already out.
And before we finished the conversation, he said, maybe my daughter would like to do a program for you. I said, oh, thank God. You know, doing music and dance and art and photography and all these other things. And I said, of course, I didn't even know what she did at that time. And he said she's an art historian and might be able to do a program on that. And I said, give me her email address or whatever. And it was just such a happy ending because we have the Blackburn portraits, copies of them in the museum, and she didn't know anything about them, but she does now. So I'd like to welcome Sara Champlin.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I am really happy to be here, and I was so grateful for that invitation from Ellen Madison to be able to learn about these wonderful portraits that we have here. And it's amazing. We have 4 of them right here in Westerly by this really, really well-known early American painter. So that's a wonderful treasure, and to be able to work with that was really, really fun. So as Ellen mentioned, my name is Sara Champlin. I am an art historian. I studied at URI, UMass, and I most recently finished my PhD out in Wisconsin at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That was in 2022. My focus has not really been American art. Yes, I've taken many courses in that, but I am trained in Greek and Roman archaeology, actually. So I've spent years excavating Pompeii, sites in Turkey, in Spain. So coming back and picking up this subject that I really enjoyed learning about in my undergraduate studies and my master's studies has been something different. But again, I'm used to doing architecture. The subject of my dissertation was on Roman baths and how in late antiquity those buildings, they were so enormous, and to maintain that with running water and all the infrastructure involved, that became really expensive to do, and as the empire was sort of declining, they weren't able to maintain those standards. So how those buildings were reused and stayed in use for hundreds and hundreds of years was really fascinating. So again, I'm used to dealing with architecture, not so much paintings, but this was really great. So anyways, bear with me. What I'm presenting today is kind of my first round research on these paintings. So kind of what I've learned, imposing sort of a framework and thinking with and learning, okay, what are these portraits trying to tell us? Why is portraiture such a familiar and repeated thing that we encounter with early American art? So here we go. These are the Babcock portraits by Joseph Blackburn. All right. So, portrait paintings were the most in-demand genre of art in colonial America. While this may not seem remarkable or strange to us today, after all, we're used to being surrounded by photographs of our loved ones, and knowing that photographic technology was not available 250 years ago, a painted likeness would have been perhaps the most accessible, yet still very expensive replacement. It should still give us reason to pause and consider why portraiture was so dominant. Why not landscapes, or still lives, or allegorical paintings, or history paintings? Why were our colonial forebears so intent on fashioning and fixing visual representations of themselves? In what follows, I will suggest that the colonial American taste for portraiture emerged from families' strong desires to establish their reputations and articulate their identities with a precise visual vocabulary that would have been immediately legible to others within their social circles. On the screen are 4 portraits portraying members of the Babcock family. When I was approached by Ellen Madison to research and present these paintings, I was happy to say yes, because what a gift in terms of subject matter. As any archaeologist will tell you, groups of objects or artifact assemblages often have the potential to tell you more than single objects. So having 4 portraits as opposed to 1 is helpful, and the fact that they are all by the same artist is a bit unusual and also very wonderful. Maybe not so unusual from a commissioning standpoint, but certainly unusual in their survival as a known family group with documented and verifiable provenance. What was also exciting to me was that all 4 were done by one of the most sought-after painters living and working in the American colonies in the decade or so leading up to the American Revolution, Joseph Blackburn. Until recently, not much was known about Blackburn's life and career. Even his name was debated until the early 20th century, because he usually signed his works as I. Blackburn, which was misinterpreted in the 19th century as being short for Jonathan Blackburn. So I stood in for J's in the Latin alphabet. Some of you may be familiar with that. And it was very fashionable at the time. And there was a story about a Jonathan Blackburn from Connecticut who painted the sign. 19th century art historians postulated that it could be the same individual, even though the style and skill apparent in the portraits suggested that their creator had received formal training in England. Several separate discoveries of receipts, paintings with more complete signatures, for example the IOS instead of just the I, and paintings by the same artist turning up in Bermuda and England provided further clues about the artist's identity and career. We now know that Joseph Blackburn, the artist responsible for these portraits, and over 100 of others from prominent New Englanders, was not from Connecticut, but was born and trained in England before traveling to America by way of Bermuda, where he was commissioned to paint some of the most illustrious families, and then on to Newport, Rhode Island, Boston, Massachusetts, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He returned to England in 1763 or 64, and the last signed and dated examples of his work are from 1778. Blackburn lived and worked in America for about a decade between 1753 and 1763. So let's turn to these portraits and to the family, the individual members. I have the portraits arranged here in the order that they were commissioned. So the first one is of Henry Babcock. He is the eldest son of Dr. Joshua Babcock and his wife Hannah Stanton Babcock, whose portraits are on the right-hand side of the screen. So we have the 2 children, or 2 of the 9 children, I should say, and then the parents on the far side. So the second portrait is of Hannah Babcock, Henry's younger sister and the family's eldest daughter. And you'll notice that the parents are both seated while their adult children are standing with landscapes and architectural details behind them. So Joshua, the patriarch, was born in Westerly in 1707. He was the youngest son of Captain James Babcock, whose father was one of the first permanent settlers of Rhode Island. Joshua was the first Rhode Islander to graduate from Yale College. He went on to study medicine in Boston and London before returning to Westerly, where he purchased a farm, that's this property, that would eventually become the Babcock-Smith House Museum. He married Hannah Stanton from Stonington and established a successful medical practice, which lasted for about a quarter of a century. He was Westerly's first qualified physician, as well as its first postmaster, and somehow also found time to run a thriving retail business all out of his home. Joshua was very civic-minded and involved in politics. He represented Westerly in the Rhode Island General Assembly for 9 years and presided as Chief Justice for the Rhode Island Supreme Court for 16 years. You may remember that Rhode Island was the first colony to declare independence. Dr. Babcock was a member of that assembly that made the decision. So he signed the Renunciation Act, the key document that removed all mention of royal authority for Rhode Island as of May 4th, 1776, which is 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. So that's kind of a major thing for the history of Westerly and the history of Rhode Island. Dr. Babcock was appointed Major General of the Rhode Island Militia, was a member of the colony's War Council, procured equipment for local troops, and served as paymaster. He also helped establish Brown University and developed a close relationship with Benjamin Franklin, who stayed here in what is now the Babcock-Smith House Museum, while it was still a house, a privately owned house, when he visited Rhode Island. He was an ardent patriot and took on a lot of responsibilities that I think give us an indication of his sense of local pride and willingness to support causes and people and ideas that he believed in. Now, his wife Hannah, I already mentioned that she was from Stonington, Connecticut, but I should also mention that her lineage was sort of equal and opposite to Joshua's. So just as Joshua's family, as he was descended from one of the first permanent settlers of Rhode Island, Hannah was the great-granddaughter of Thomas Stanton, who is often described as one of early Connecticut's most important figures. He was a successful trader, a co-founder of Hartford, 1636, and Stonington, around 1650. He was a Pequot war combatant, a skilled negotiator and interpreter of native languages, and a distinguished public servant. He was a magistrate and a member of Connecticut's General Assembly. So this impressive lineage was almost certainly one of the reasons that Joshua sought Hannah's hand in marriage. She may have been completely charming, but most marriages of that time did not start out as love matches. They would have been strategically planned as social contracts with an eye towards strengthening and expanding networks, bolstering financial security, and providing the best possible alliances, opportunities, wealth, and pedigrees for one's future children. Unfortunately, although not unexpectedly, not much information has survived or is publicly available about Hannah, her personalities, her hobbies, but we do know some of the important dates in her life. For example, we know her birth, 1714, the date of her marriage to Dr. Babcock, 1735, and her death in 1778, as well as the births of all 9 of her children. So that's right, Hannah and Joshua had 9 children, and we only have portraits of 2, the 2 that were on the screen above, the oldest boy and oldest girl. I think that's really interesting and something that we may want to circle back to in the end, because again, there are portraits of some of the other children, but they were not commissioned by the family. They were done later when they were adults and could have their own portraits. So that's interesting because it's really different than our take on family portraiture nowadays. Okay, so back to Hannah. She was 64 years old when this portrait of her was painted. And I do want to read this one description of her character that I came across. It's from a diary of Ezra Stiles, who was a Congregationalist minister and an academic who was the president of Yale College, and like Joshua, also helped to found Brown University. He wrote that Mrs. Babcock was, quote, a most excellent woman, the law of kindness was upon her tongue, her prudence and amiableness of manners, as well as her virtues and love of all the religions rendered her the ornament of her sex. Her husband, quote, accounted her his glory, end quote. I think that is a very agreeable description. I'm sure Joshua and Hannah both would have been very delighted with it. But it's also really vague, right? Like, how would you feel if someone were describing you this way, like an ornament of your sex? And it's kind of awkward, right? But this is the type of thing that would have been said about most women of the day, unless it was categorically untrue, and then you might hear some other things. But like generally, this was a pretty, tame and good assessment of female virtue. Let's see. Here's I included this slide. This is where the portraits are hung today. I should mention, the portraits, the Babcock-Smith house does not have the originals in their collection. They are all on view at other museums within Rhode Island and Connecticut and surrounding areas. But they do have these really nice reproductions, and here is where they have them displayed in the main house. And notice they make a really nice pair. These two were actually commissioned to be pendant portraits. That means hung and displayed together, so the figures are sort of making parentheses. They go together as an actual pair. So here are the portraits of Joshua and Hannah's children, their eldest boy and eldest girl. The portrait of Henry, or Harry as he was sometimes called, was painted in 1756 when he was about 20 years old. It depicts him as a well-dressed young man with his left hand against his hip and his right arm resting on top of a post. The pose would have been carefully planned by the artist or selected by the sitter and his family to convey important information about Harry beyond the details of his physical appearance. For instance, the hand on his hip, engaged left leg, relaxed right knee, and arm resting on the post suggest an air of authority and relaxed confidence. That he is holding his fashionable tri-cornered hat and not wearing it provides proof of his genteel upbringing and polite manners, as well as conveniently allowing his meticulously styled hair or wig to remain visible as another cue about his social status. So not everyone of the day would have worn wigs, for instance. That would have been something that only members of the kind of elite social circles would have done. Harry entered Yale at the age of 12, can you imagine? And graduated at the head of his class at the age of 16. In this portrait, it's not immediately apparent that he was a military man because he's not wearing a uniform. But in 1756, the year it was done, he was serving in the Rhode Island regiment in the French and Indian War. He had not yet attained the rank of colonel, but was already leading an independent company of infantry that he had obtained a charter for 2 years prior, at the age of 18. This swiftness or ability and ambition were encouraged and celebrated as appropriate traits in young men at the time. The expectations for young women were very different. In the 18th century, it was almost unheard of for young women to receive any formal education. They may have been taught to read and write, especially if they were from wealthy or upper middle class families. All of the Babcock children, including the girls, were taught to read and write in English and possibly in other languages too. We know that Joshua Babcock, for example, was fluent in Latin and Greek. He taught his Sunday Bible lessons with his family by reading a Greek Bible. So presumably his children may have also learned from him. The girls may have been exposed to French. Girls, well, all of the children would have also been exposed to poetry, math, and history, the same subjects that their brothers were exposed to at a young age. The girls would have learned from their mother about the proper behavior of a woman and the rudiments of running a household. Fiber crafts, such as weaving or needlepoint, may have been productive pastimes. The exhibition of good manners and social graces, as well as religious and moral rectitude, would have been the most important parts of their education. Young Hannah's portrait was painted in 1759 when she was just 16 years old. Her head is in a similar position to her brother's, turned to the right and at a similar height on the canvas. But her pose is very different. Whereas Harry's pose is open and relaxed, Hannah's is more closed off and guarded. Her wrists are crossed in front of her, creating a delicate yet also very deliberate barrier. All four portraits seem a bit dark and somber, but the tonal range of Hannah's is the most subtle, with the blues, greens, and browns harmonizing to create a sort of ethereal beauty. At first I wanted to describe Hannah's dress as a cream color, but on further inspection, it's really a very, very pale blue, and it's picked up mostly in the small details, such as in the embroidery at the edges of her bodice, and occasionally in the dark and light colors that are used to create the illusion of folds in the fabric. The bows are the most pronounced use of blue. Blue was a popular color in 18th century paintings, especially for women's clothing, because it was associated with, quote, true faith, continued affections, and constancy, end quote. It was also conventionally associated associated with the sky and with divine powers. So think of a lot of religious paintings that you see. It's usually used for marriage robes, so symbolizing this idea of magic and religion. Blue also had specifically aristocratic connotation, as it was one of the most expensive pigments, crushed lapis lazuli, second only to gold, and it recalled some other precious objects, such as silk. And for example, this Chinese Ming porcelain was very widely admired and eagerly sought, bought, prized, and imitated. Her unblemished pale skin was another reference or visual analogy to these valuable trade goods. What was happening here was that the artist was trying to link these qualities with this young woman, as if saying this young woman is as expensive, as beautiful, and worthy of admiration as these other things. So I love the writing of Margaretta Lovell. She's an art historian that's written a lot about 18th century American portraiture. And there's this passage where she talks about conventions for portraits of young women. And she's describing another painting, but her words could just as easily apply to this portrait of Hannah. Quote, "It is a sympathetic face, soft and dreamy. She wears an entirely natural expression, but it is also that prescribed for a young woman dancing, that is, socially presenting herself as a work of art," end quote. Lovell quotes a passage from a guidebook about manners and bodily posture for young women. Quote, "Let the eyes appear lively and modest, and the face express neither mirth nor gravity, but the medium, which will form an admirable mean and always be agreeable," end quote. So this is from Francis Niblong's 1737 book, The Rudiments of Genteel Behavior. This is something, Hannah probably had this as a little manual. This is a guidebook, how young women of the day are supposed to act. It is definitely something that the artist, Joseph Blackburn, would have been aware of. He probably had a copy in his studio. Most artists at the time, that was like their Bible in how to present elite people of the day. So let's see. Joseph Blackburn would have been intimately familiar with this book and all that it prescribed. I'll turn to that in a moment, but first I'd like to draw your attention to a few other details in Hannah's portrait. So notice the pearls and lace on her dress, and also the feather that she holds in her hand. These details were included because they were fashionable and feminine, yes, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because they alluded to the family's wealth and sophistication. And they gave the artist an opportunity to show off his skills in convincingly rendering different fabrics and different textures. The background also contains important visual cues about Hannah, or at least it provides information about how 18th century viewers would have been intended or socially conditioned to read Hannah's portrait. You can see the faint silhouette of an urn. You see it in the background of the full portrait. And beyond the low balustrade on the opposite side of her, there's a suggestion of verdant trees and a touch of pink in the sky to echo the healthy blush in her cheeks, and also to evoke the interconnected ideas of sunrise, blossoming, and fertility. So urns have a very long tradition in art history of being references to fertility in art because their shape is sort of womb-like. So we see this a lot in paintings of young women as a symbol of this is their future, they're going to produce children. This portrait is a celebration and a poetic reference to the subject being, she's 16 years old, she's on the cusp of womanhood, getting ready to be engaged. Hannah's pose may seem a bit stiff and unnatural to our eyes, but under this confection of a dress, her posture and form would have been reinforced by a rigid whalebone corset. There would have been no slouching allowed for genteel young women. Now, Hannah may not have owned this dress, and that's not to say that she couldn't have owned it, or that the artist was trying to flatter her by making her clothes appear more fashionable and expensive than they would have been in real life. The point is that it didn't matter whether they were her own clothes or not, because no one expected them to be. Artists usually kept stock clothing on hand to dress these, what they called laymen or dolls that they kept in their studios so that they could pose them and reduce the amount of time that the subject needed to sit still. The important thing was that the subject's face was rendered from life. The rest, that's the clothing, the background, and props, those could be finished later without taking up any more valuable time from the sitter. It was more the norm that this would happen than otherwise, as suggested by surviving testimonies, where it is specifically mentioned when the artist uses clothing owned by the sitter. An example of this type of testimony comes from a 1751 letter, where a young man writes from London to his mother in Charleston, praising the skill of the painter, Allan Ramsay, who had recently completed his portrait. It says, quote, "The drapery is all taken from my own clothes, and the very flowers and the lace upon the hat are taken from a hat of my own." So the fact that this is something that someone actually takes the time to comment on is kind of unusual. But it's interesting nonetheless. Another technique that artists employed was to work from reproductions. Mezzotints were popular, and artists often acquired loose leaf prints or bound volumes to keep as references. They could then flip through and adapt the details however they wanted. Sometimes that meant copying a pose or another idea, maybe a book or a globe or whatever other prop. The artist could do it exactly, or combine different details from, pick and choose. I like this, I like this. This seems kind of wild as today, especially with all of our copyright concerns, what people can reproduce without getting in too much trouble about, but back then that was really a standard practice, and artists were not shy or secretive about it. They would use mezzotints or other engravings to demonstrate that they knew what the latest fashions were in England. So being in possession of prints, and especially these bound booklets of prints, was a very good way to attract clientele, especially when they thought it was beneath their dignity to have signs hung outside of their shops to sort of advertise their skill. So it's the same idea of today when you go into a salon and they have these style suggestions. I want this haircut, but can you do it with bangs? Can you do it this length? It's pick and choose. So here on the left-hand side, that's the mezzotint that is thought inspired Hannah's portrait. You'll notice that the costume, the pose, and the background are all nearly identical. The mezzotint was a full-length portrait of the daughter of Thomas Hudson, another well-known English artist, who allowed his original oil painting to be reproduced as a mezzotint to reach a wider audience. Blackburn also seems to have been aware of this mezzotint on the right-hand side of the screen of Lady Boyd, after a portrait by the Scottish painter Allan Ramsay. It's a very similar dress, but the pearls on the bodice give it an added flair, which Blackburn picked up on and used in a more subtle way for Hannah's dress. He reproduced these conventions, or looks that he was comfortable painting, and that were very popular amongst his clientele more than once over the course of his career. So it's not just that he's the artist that's reproducing this one look. It becomes kind of a style that many artists during this period use. And this next slide, this shows some of the examples that I was able to track down. So there's like 12 or 14 just by Joseph Blackburn alone, and they're remarkably similar. All the same style dress. Color can be different. There's some pinks, some like pale yellows all thrown in there, but they all have that signature bow, the bell sleeves. They're all very, very similar. And these next couple of slides just show them a little bit larger. These are all well-known ladies of the time, all elite people. Some of them would have known each other. And being able to see these portraits in each other's houses is kind of what inspired, I would like a portrait of myself like this. So that's kind of interesting. Again, very similar, very whimsical. Some of them too have these shawls billowing out behind them. They're very romantic in that way. And this one I thought was kind of cute, so I included it. A girl much younger than these other women, or young women, that are supposedly on the cusp of womanhood. And they're showing this girl who's probably, 9, 10 years old, as assuming the pose of someone who in a few years will be at that, cusp of womanhood stage. Really interesting. So this deep dive that I've just done with Hannah's portrait could be replicated with any of the portraits. All of them follow established conventions of pose, props, attire, etc., so that the subject is represented appropriately according to their gender, age, and social class. This is one of the reasons why it was imperative for artists or aspiring artists to be aware of the behaviors of of genteel society. If they were going to be entrusted with the task of creating a portrait, then the person commissioning it needed to be sure that the artist they had selected was capable, not only in terms of technical ability, but also in recognizing the very nuanced social cues and behaviors believed society, so that they could render them successfully in paint. Another reason that artists needed to be aware of the behaviors of genteel society was so that they themselves could function within that elevated world and gain new opportunities for employment. Artists, any artists, but we are dealing specifically with painters here, were not necessarily thought of as belonging to genteel society. They were skilled craftsmen on par with furniture makers, silversmiths, milliners, stonecutters, practitioners of nearly any trade that required working with one's hands. They relied on making a good impression by the quality of their craftsmanship and establishing a reputation for consistency. Letters of introduction were one of the most important ways for artists to expand their circles of acquaintance and gain new commissions. Here's an example from the archives of the Newport Historical Society that pertains to Blackburn in the very early days of his career in the colonies, right after he landed in Newport. It was written by Mr. Thomas Vernon, a wealthy and well-connected gentleman from Newport, to a Mr. James Boutineau of Boston. So the letter is dated November 25th, 1754, written from Newport, Rhode Island. I hope that you'll excuse the liberty I shall now take of recommending the bearer, Mr. Blackburn, to your favor and friendship. He is late from the island of Bermuda, a limner by profession and is allowed to excel in that science, has now spent some months in this place and behaved in all respects as becomes a gentleman, being possessed with the agreeable qualities of great modesty, good sense, and genteel behavior. He purposes, if suitable encouragements, to make some stay in Boston, and will be an entire stranger there. Shall therefore be obliged to you or friends for any civilities you are pleased to show him. My best compliments with Mrs. Vernon, to your good lady, Miss Suki and Miss Nancy, whose pictures I'll expect to see in Boston, drawn by the above gent, and believe me in all respects, your most obedient, humble servant, and case, Thomas Vernon. So Blackburn seems to have had plenty of commissions while he was in Newport during the first few months after his arrival, but this letter demonstrates that he was eager to meet new people and expand his network. He would have been conscious that prospects in one location were likely to dwindle over time, because once people had their portraits painted, they usually did not come back for a second one right away. It would be many, many years, if ever, that they wouldn't have need of a second one. So Blackburn did eventually go to Boston. We know of at least 13 signed and dated works that he did while in Boston, but so far no portraits of Mr. Boutineau's daughters have come to light. The letter describes Blackburn as a limner, so that's a word that we don't really use nowadays, but in 18th century, and particularly in the American colonial context, it meant someone who earned their living by painting portraits, sometimes miniatures, but also larger canvases. The word comes from the Middle English limpnor, which is an alteration of luminor, from the Latin luminare. So the most common, what I can think the most common usage of this word is from medieval manuscripts, and they have the illuminated pages, really decorative, and they're meant to keep the reader. So think a lot of people in medieval times, they weren't literate, so having these pages that could stimulate, okay, what are we talking about here? And that have drawings from the Bible or something that would keep their mind trained on what they were looking at. So it's kind of the same idea of teaching, providing instruction for the person who is viewing it. So portraits function in a very similar way. I'm talking about early American portraits. They were these vessels of familial devotion. People would have them done for their children to make these connections of this is your responsibility, these are your family members, and you're supposed to love and treat them a certain way. So let's see, being a limner was a continuance of that same medieval tradition of producing illuminated or colorful painted things that were decorative but also served a deeper purpose of acting as mnemonic devices just as the marginalia and medieval illuminated manuscripts were meant to remind readers about the religious text they were reading, admonishments to behave a certain way, so the products of later lindners were similarly understood both as mnemonic devices and instruments for instruction. The date of the letter is also noteworthy, 1754. So Blackburn's first signed and dated portrait of a Boston resident is from 1755. What was going on in Boston in 1755? If you're familiar with colonial American art, or even if you aren't, some of you may have heard the name Jonathan Singleton Copley. So he's usually heralded as America's greatest colonial painter, okay? So I have two of his most recognizable works here on the screen. The first one over here on the left is of Paul Revere, who of course was a silversmith and also famous for his Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And then on the far side, that is the artist's younger brother, known just simply as Boy with a Flying Squirrel. This was the first painting that he exhibited in London. And let's see. So I just want to show you some of the details in these paintings. So this, I think I put the Paul Revere painting up because I think most people, if you've ever heard of Copley, that's the painting that you know. This one I think is a little bit less known, but the details in it are just fascinating. That luminous quality is almost reflective. Like, look at the glass. He renders water so realistically. It's amazing. And the chain, and apparently at the time they would tame squirrels. Can you imagine having a squirrel? Look at that little picture, he's cute. Okay, so in 1755, Copley would have been about 17 years old, just starting his career. He was living and working in Boston, so it's not a huge stretch to believe that he and Blackburn may have crossed paths. For a long time, there was an idea that Copley may have been a student of Joseph Blackburn. Their styles are very similar to each other, and there are several examples of pendant pairs where one canvas was completed by Copley, usually the male, and the other by Blackburn. So to some art historians, it suggested that they had a partnership and accepted joint commissions. I don't think anyone believes this anymore, but it is interesting. And it's interesting also, I think, that when you do have these pairs with the male by Copley and the female by Blackburn, it's reminiscent of their styles. So Blackburn was thought to have been a drapery artist, so someone that specialized in doing clothing. So maybe that's why he did more feminine portraits, because there was a greater amount of texture that needed to be done there, and Copley may have done masculine portraits because of this idea of detail. Maybe more detail, more of a sense of individualization in the faces. So here's another example of Copley's work, and I'm showing you this one because it's a portrait of John Bors, the man that young Hannah married about 3 years after her portrait by Blackburn. Bors' portrait was painted between 1760 and 62, just a year or so after Hannah's portrait. Their marriage was probably facilitated by the fact that both of their fathers were involved in Rhode Island's early government. Bors lived in Newport, where for a while he made a very successful living from his shop on Thames Street, selling goods that were imported from Europe and the West Indies, such as textiles, base metals, raisins, tea, coffee, sugar, all that sort of stuff. We know what happened with taxes in the years leading up to the Revolution and even after. They skyrocketed, right? Unfortunately, Bors and his family faced a sharp financial decline, but that was decades after these portraits had been done. So they already existed, and for now, the way he's represented, he has achieved a defining moment in his life. He's come into his inheritance, and he's ready to marry. He is mature, handsome, and his clothing in the Queen Anne style corner chair that he is sitting in attests to his good taste and financial stability. His pose suggests that he is comfortable and confident, while his distant gaze and the placement of his hands, one holding a book and the other near his temple, cues the viewer to make the implied connection that he also lives a life of intellectual pursuit. This was true, and there are surviving records that show he was a leader of the Redwood Library, which was at the heart of Newport's intellectual life. He was on the board of directors there from 1761, around the time of the commissioning of this portrait, until 1809. He served as the library's treasurer, moderator, and president at various times during those years. Boers was also very active in the activities of the Trinity Church. All the visual cues about Boers' identity that Copley encoded in his portrait are spot on. They align perfectly with the young gentleman's public persona and probably also with his perceived self, or at least his ideal, desired self-perception. Some 19th century art historians wrote about Blackburn's decision to return to England as if he was retreating home with his tail between his legs, pouting that the younger artist's skill had eclipsed his own. If the records that have turned up in England for Joseph Blackburn of Worcester can be securely linked to the artist, as seems probable, then it is more likely that Blackburn was simply ready to return home. He had accumulated enough wealth during his travels and inherited property in England a year or two prior to his departure from the colonies. Parish records show that the man named Joseph Blackburn, that we think could be the one and the same as this artist, had a wife and 2 daughters, and after a prolonged absence, he was probably eager to return to him. So a lot of historians here in the States will remark that, well, how come we don't have any record of marriage? This guy was, middle-aged at this point. How come he never got married while he was here? How come there are no lawsuits? He has no record other than he was, a well-known painter and he painted lots of portraits. I tend to think, well, he came over here with a mission, which was to gain employment, secure all of these commissions, make a lot of money, and go back home, where he already had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him. I mean, that makes sense to me. Anyways, let's see. So Copley's skills, even as a young man, were very impressive, but I think there was also enough wealth here in the colonies and a need for painters that, the colonies could have supported 2 very successful painters. I don't think there was any question about that. And both of them could have happily flourished here. Blackburn presumably would not have felt threatened by the younger artist because, unlike Copley, he seems to have had formal training and he had several years more experience. Blackburn had probably worked in the studio back in England, where he would have been one of many craftsmen that lent their skill to a single canvas. Many London studios had a famous master painter that would do faces and apprentices that would fill in the drapery, architecture, and whatever other props were needed. If Blackburn specialized in painting drapery during his early career in England, as has often been proposed, then he may have wanted an opportunity to prove that he had a greater level of skill, that he could do more and possibly earn more. So that first commission that took him to Bermuda was successful, and it opened the door for him to establish his own reputation and build a very lucrative career. Hannah and John Boer's portraits may have eventually hung side by side, or at least in the same household. Remember, hers was commissioned by her parents who lived here on this property. And it's there, I wouldn't say it's 100% been proven, but I can't imagine that it would not have been, that John Boers, her intended, saw that painting and thought, okay, well, I'm asking for this young lady's hand in marriage. I'm going to have my portrait painted next year. I want these to be able to be hung next to each other eventually, and had his done in the same style. So I should emphasize that portraits were not intended to be viewed or interpreted as objects in isolation. They gained meaning through the relationships that they shared with other portraits and even with other household items. So they were objects of the domestic sphere, but liminal in a really interesting way because of the purposes that they served as social documents, and because of the locations where they were typically hung, not in front entrances, but usually in a father's study or other room where business was conducted, or in parlors used for entertaining guests. In the case of the Babcock portraits, all 4 were listed in the inventory of Joshua's estate as being in the south room. Other objects listed in that space include a mezzotint of Doc Franklin. Remember that Joshua was very good friends with Benjamin Franklin, and just by virtue of having his portrait was a visual link to their friendship, just a visual reference there. Other items in that space include a large looking glass, a large oval mahogany table, 6 mahogany chairs, a tea chest, a couch with red pillows, 11 china plates, 14 china cups, 9 saucers, 2 pounds of tea, wine glasses, volumes of Rapin's History of England, and not just any floor covering, but a Wilton carpet, a brand known for being a luxury, high-status import from England, often with neoclassical or Persian-inspired pattern. So even if I didn't know anything about the layout of the house, just from this inventory list alone, it sounds like this was a parlor or some other elaborately decorated space used for entertaining guests. The portraits were neither fully public nor fully private because their intended audience consisted of themselves, that is the people who were being portrayed, their family, and other select people who were invited into this private sphere of their home. This brings me full circle to the questions that I asked in the beginning of this presentation. Why portraits? Why, above any other genre of painting, did 18th century elites commission images of themselves and their loved ones? The answer, to my mind, is pride. These portraits were about establishing a fulfilling narrative for oneself, for friends, and for social peers, for family, and especially for future generations. Beyond reproducing a physical likeness of an individual and immortalizing a specific moment in that person's life, the portraits captured, created, or fixed, cemented, memorialized, or preserved a grander statement about their identity, their values, their manners, and their place in the world. So our little town of Westerly was not overlooked, but was an active participant in and a contributor towards a pervasive national, and some might even argue international, artistic trend. The town's residents, represented here by the members of the Babcock family, participated in complex networks of trade, politics, family alliances, and the production of meaning in images. Through these portraits, Westerly is made visible in the mosaic of early American social history and its representation through art. Thank you.